We are born to move. It's in our DNA. Yet today, freedom of mobility is at stake. Climate change is reshaping every aspect of life for the world's more than 8 billion people. The shift away from fossil fuels to electric vehicles is happening. Yet the high costs of production limit affordability and thus mobility for many. As we all recognize the urgency to achieve a decarbonized world, we must unite our voices to provide freedom of movement for everyone. And invent solutions with an open mindset to create full, long-term impact. Now, it's time to open the doors and join together with passionate people who can offer a holistic view that embraces science-based contributions as the basis for discussion. Creating a decarbonized future is our ultimate existential challenge. But only when we face reality can we truly begin to create a life where our modes of transportation and our Earth live in harmony for all citizens, no matter how you choose to move. The Freedom of Mobility Forum is a collaborative space for whoever is ready to test ideas, challenge conventional approaches, and play a crucial role in shaping the future of mobility with fact-based expertise, transparency, and honesty. Let's embrace together a new realism where freedom of mobility is not just for the select few, but for everyone. To join us and keep up with the latest, visit freedomofmobilityforum.org.
Welcome to the second edition of the Freedom of Mobility Forum's live debate. My name is Cecilia Edwards, and I'm your moderator for today's event. This forum is designed to be a public place for debate that allows diverse contributors to bring fact-based elements to the table and spark an open and transparent dialogue on how to ensure equitable freedom of mobility while simultaneously mitigating climate change. Each year, the event tackles one topic of this complex issue, and panelists are invited to bring their unique perspectives. As live attendees, you will have an opportunity to ask questions to our panelists during each of the day's 3 segments. I encourage you to enter your questions so we have an opportunity to address them. In fact, many of you have already started entering questions, and the moderation has begun. Our topic for this year is how will our planet accommodate the mobility needs of 8 billion people? We ask this question because of the pivotal challenges ahead of us as a global society. Over the past 50 years, the global population has skyrocketed from 2 billion to almost 8 billion individuals. According to the United Nations, the population is expected to reach 9.7 billion by 2050. With this exponential growth comes a corresponding increased demand for mobility. However, meeting the mobility needs of all poses numerous obstacles: a strain on natural resources, financial burdens, increased urban congestion, and most of all, significant environmental impact. There are 9 planetary boundaries that define the limits within which humanity can continue to develop and thrive while ensuring the stability and resilience of the Earth's systems. 6 of these 9 have already been crossed, putting us in a position of increased risk to both people and ecosystems. In other words, we must act urgently to address environmental sustainability on a global scale. These challenges jeopardize a cornerstone of modern society, our need for and our freedom of movement. It is a global issue affecting every citizen, regardless of their socioeconomic status or geographic location. But how ready are we to collectively make the changes happen that balance our mobility needs and the environment? I am pleased to invite Alexandre Devenot, General Manager of France of the global online research company YouGov.
Hi, Cecilia.
Hi.
Very happy to see you.
Welcome, Alex. Alex will share the results of the company's exclusive survey that they completed for this forum. The survey aimed to measure the appetite for change in mobility habits among over 5,000 respondents from 5 countries: Brazil, France, India, Morocco, and the United States. This survey gathered insights through 3 questions on mobility, providing valuable data on current lifestyle and mobility trends worldwide. But before you proceed with sharing your results, Alexandre, I'm curious to know, what motivated YouGov's participation in this debate?
Thank you for asking the question, Cecilia. YouGov is a global online research company offering insights into what the world thinks. We speak daily to our panel of over 26 million members around the world to understand their opinions and behavior. One of the key pillars of our social mission is to make people's opinion heard for the benefit of the wider community. As such, we are more than happy to partner with the Freedom of Mobility Forum to get a better understanding of how our planet will accommodate the mobility needs of 8 billion people.
Thank you. Now, could you present the key findings of this survey?
1 in 4 global citizens have not changed their transportation choices to limit their impact on the environment and do not plan on doing so. This is especially true in USA, where almost 40% of the citizens have no plan to change their transportation habits. This percentage is mainly driven by the older generation and those living in rural areas. A majority of these groups have no plan to change anything. Living outside of big cities tends to be a key factor of people not wanting to change their transportation choices, likely because transportation is often a greater challenge in rural areas. Of note, the income level tends to impact the results, even significantly in India and USA. Citizens with the highest incomes are the most likely to consider changes. Our data also shows that while 1 in 4 are not ready to change anything, 3 in 4 global citizens are ready to make some change, which is very encouraging. However, focusing on those who are active and have already implemented radical changes, it's less than 10% of global citizens. India is the country with the highest proportion, reaching almost 15%, whereas France is slightly above 5%. This clearly outlines that the journey towards greener transportation is a long one and that we are only at the very beginning. Having said that, more than 6 in 10 global citizens are ready to stop using means of transportation where they are the only passenger. There is, however, a strong disparity between markets on that topics. A larger proportion of citizens in Brazil, India, and Morocco are ready to do so compared to France and USA. Data show more openness from the older generation, Gen X and Boomers, in those 3 countries to change their habits. Overall, rurality drives the result down, probably highlighting the need to propose viable alternatives to solo transportation modes in rural areas. For any anticipated changes, lawmakers and citizens are the stakeholders seen as having the biggest influence in driving change for greener transportation options, followed by companies to a lesser extent, except in USA. Lawmakers and citizens form much more of the expectation in this area than the media, the world's richest people, scientists, celebrities, or non-governmental organizations.
So, Alexandre, you mentioned the older generations. What noteworthy insights did the survey provide regarding the perspectives of the youth?
Indeed, Cecilia, the role of young generation is a vital perspective. Indeed, 1 in 4 global citizens believe that the young generation can influence the change for greener transportation. This figure rises to almost 40% of those surveyed in India. In USA, young generation, Gen Z and millennials are by far those who are most prepared to make changes in their transportation choices to limit their impact on the environment. Additionally, they are the demographic most likely to agree to stop using means of transportation where they are the only passenger. However, less than 10% of the Gen Z and millennials generation have already started making radical changes to their behaviors. Also, young generation will likely be influential in driving change for greener transportation. Their actions are not yet more tangible than the rest of the population. How younger people behave is likely to come to the forefront in the near future. Indeed, their choices and the dynamic resulting from them will strongly influence the transportation challenges that will have to be addressed worldwide. So the question is, how do we incorporate them in the discussion? What's the call for action for the young generations?
So thanks for those insights, Alexandre.
Thank you, Cecilia.
And for our audience, please note that the complete report will be available on the forum's website right after this debate. Today, we will focus on 3 key dimensions of our overarching theme: technology, business, and social justice. The technology discussion will enable us to explore the increasing scarcity of the natural resources needed for the current and future mobility of people and goods. This will lead us to think of technologies and innovations that can help ensure the optimal use of these resources. The business dimension will allow us to explore existing and new solutions and business models to enhance accessibility for all while minimizing environmental impacts. And lastly, the social justice perspective will allow us to delve into how our current lifestyles and mobility habits might be challenged by the climate crisis. Our discussions will also explore pathways towards achieving mobility equity, allowing all citizens to fulfill their vital social and economic needs. So as you can see, we're going to explore our topic: how will our planet accommodate the mobility needs of 8 billion people from different dimensions? We thought it equally important to explore this topic from various points of view. And so now, let us welcome our panelists from across the world representing a variety of stakeholder groups and expertise. Majora Carter from the United States is a renowned urban revitalization strategist. She emphasizes the need for a sustainable and inclusive infrastructure to address persistent poverty in underserved communities and prevent community displacement while improving economic opportunities. Welcome, Majora. Manal Jalloul from Lebanon is the co-founder and CEO of AI Lab. As an artificial intelligence expert, she explores the potential of AI and emerging technologies to drive innovation in both technology and business realms. Welcome, Manal. How are you today?
Thank you, Cecilia.
Roberto Schaefer from Brazil is a professor of energy economics who, over the past 25 years, has made significant contributions to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. He analyzes transformative measures needed to reach net zero emissions by 2050, with a particular focus on sustainable energy sources. Welcome, Roberto.
Hello, Cecilia. Good morning. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well. Matthias Schmelzer from Germany is an economic historian, social theorist, and a climate activist. His main interests include the political economy of capitalism, social and environmental history, climate catastrophe, neoliberalism, and alternative economics, including the concept of degrowth. Welcome, Matthias.
Hello.
Hello. And finally, Carlos Tavares from Portugal is the CEO and executive director of Stellantis, a mobility tech company. He focuses on Stellantis' objective to provide clean, safe, and affordable mobility while driving the company towards an ambitious carbon net zero target by 2038. Welcome, Carlos. So welcome to all of our panelists. A moment ago, Alexandre mentioned the important role youth play in shaping the world's future mobility solutions. In response, we collaborated with 3 leading universities to conduct semester-long research projects to help shape the questions for this year's debate. Spokespersons from each university will deliver a brief overview of their work and kick off the questions to our panelists. All of my follow-up questions have been developed in partnership with the students to ensure that we are including the concerns and expectations of the younger generations. 6 students from ENSA, an engineering school based in Kenitra, Morocco, took the research on the technology dimension. 5 students from HEC, a business school located in Paris, France, looked at the business perspective. And 10 students from Brandeis's Heller School of Social Policy and Management, located near Boston, Massachusetts, in the United States, explored issues related to the social justice and equity. We are now ready to start with our first dimension. Under the supervision of Ismaël Legrat, the students from ENSA focused their work on understanding how heavily dependent our transportation modes are on natural resources, the pressure this poses on our reserves, and the technological innovations that have the potential to alleviate some of that dependency. Representing ENSA, I am pleased to welcome Abir Mesbahi.
Thank you, Cecilia. How can we satisfy the mobility needs of 8 billion people while safeguarding our environment? Our overuse of natural resources causes land degradation, water scarcity, and soaring air pollution. Thus, greater levels of innovation are imperative. My engineering classmates and I have done our research to develop a vision based on scientific evidence. A look at 3 main energy sources currently used and planned gives us a good picture of an important aspect of the world's mobility journey. First, petroleum fuel has served us in the past, powering traditional vehicles, and has become a major contributor to CO2 emissions due to its widespread use. Global oil consumption increased almost 9-fold since 1950 and roughly doubled since 1980. The rate at which we are consuming this fossil energy source will lead to the depletion of the Earth's natural resources. Therefore, petroleum cannot be our fuel for the future. However, until we transition away from it, we suggest deploying advanced seismic imaging technologies to better understand subsurface reservoirs, thereby minimizing drilling and environmental impacts. Second, lithium-ion batteries expected to see a 27% annual growth in demand by 2030. Power electric vehicles would generate significantly lower carbon emissions when driven. Yet lithium, another finite natural resource, might eventually face scarcity issues when used at full scale. This questions the long-term viability of this solution for meeting mobility needs and calls for coordinated efforts in battery use and disposal, for example through global design and production standards. Lastly, green hydrogen offers a clean alternative for the future. Yet, its production is costly and requires significant amounts of water and sustainable energy. For example, a London to New York flight fueled by green hydrogen-based kerosene would consume as much water as 1,800 US citizens do in a day. Innovative solutions such as hydrogen hubs are needed to reduce costs. Achieving full sustainability requires further innovation like integrated water recycling and treatment systems to support reuse. While transitioning to more sustainable energy sources, we still need to protect our planet, as the production process of these sources can lead to environmental and social hazards. Immediate efforts to reduce the use of natural resources, prioritize recycling and reuse, and bolster public transportation are imperative. Besides, we must raise awareness of more responsible ways of mobility and opt for global standards. So, I'm pleading with everyone to not be satisfied with our current pace of change. We must urgently innovate to minimize the destruction of our planet and protect our future. The time for action is now. Should we prioritize innovation-driven solutions for resource-efficient mobility, even if it means disrupting traditional industries and livelihoods?
Thank you for that summary and for your challenge, Abir. Can you please pose your first question to Roberto?
We see electric mobility as the best solution today to reduce our consumption of fossil fuel. How, when we speed up the shift to electric mobility, will we handle the demand for lithium the batteries will produce?
Well, thank you very much for the question. Very interesting. Congratulations for your work. I think there are many critical issues here. I think it's not true that electric mobility is the best solution. Many studies do not corroborate with this vision. I think, and some colleagues of mine also think like that, this is very much a kind of a global north perspective. But the world is much bigger than the global north. Just to put this into perspective, some 800 million people in the world today do not have access to electricity. And many more do not have access to stable electricity. So how can you think about electricity for powering vehicles if you don't have even electricity for more than 800 million people to do other things than mobility? So for sure, electric mobility is not the solution, at least in the next 20 or 30 years, when we really need to go to net zero. So I don't think electricity is the solution for mobility. So if, let's say, electricity is not a solution for replacing mobility, what can we do in that case? Because we have to think about, let's say, energy poverty, transportation poverty is a real thing in the global south and in the globe as well. So we have to have in mind that there is no one size fits all when it comes to mobility. So for some places, for some people, eventually non-motorized mobility may be one of the solutions. Public transportation, for sure, is probably the best solution. And in that case, public transportation may or may not be electric. And even if you use electricity for public transportation, this doesn't mean that we have to rely on batteries, because we already have other electric technologies available for public transportation. So eventually this will not put let's say, too much impact on, for example, lithium that we have mentioned. For other places, I would mention, for example, Central America, South America, and even Africa, drop-in biofuels is a much, much better solution than electric vehicles. Why? Simply because drop-in biofuels mean that you can use the existing motorization in the existing fuels, in the existing, let's say, cars and buses, using an alternative fuel, which I think is much, much better than electricity, because if you think about the climate emergency, the need to go to net zero, if you go to electricity for mobility, at most you can go to zero. If you rely on biofuels, you can go to negative emissions. And in that case, you can compensate for those emissions that will happen anyway in other sectors of our economy. So biofuels is also a possibility.
So thank you for
Also,
that, Roberto.
even when you talk about, I'm almost done.
Okay.
Yes.
So thank you for that. We're gonna get to the public transportation and a couple of those in a moment. So thank you for those opening comments. But Manal, I want you to hop in for a moment. So while Roberto thinks that EVs aren't the solution, but we're on the path to doing that right now. So what role could AI play in accelerating, if we wanted to do that, to make the acceleration to the transition to EVs? How would we handle that?
Yeah, so hi, Cecilia. First of all, I'd like to congratulate the team on the excellent research. I do agree with Roberto that electric vehicles might not be the best option in many locations in the world, but we know that a lot of nations, especially developed ones like Europe and the US and perhaps Australia, are moving towards net zero emissions by using electric vehicles. And within these nations, as the shift towards electric mobility accelerates, AI does emerge as a vital ally in managing the soaring demand for lithium, essentially for electric vehicle batteries. Through its capabilities, AI can optimize the lithium extraction and processing by employing predictive analytics, for example, for pinpointing deposit locations and enhancing process efficiencies. So this not only makes extraction more sustainable, but also maximizes yield with minimal environmental impact. Now, in the realm of battery recycling, AI can revolutionize the process through advanced sorting and extraction techniques, ensuring that valuable materials from spent batteries are efficiently recovered, reintegrated into the production cycle. Now, that significantly reduces the need for fresh lithium extraction, which aligns with sustainability goals. Furthermore, AI's power in supply chain and demand forecasting would enable a smarter allocation of resources and informed decision-making. By accurately predicting lithium supply and demand scenarios, AI can facilitate the dynamic demand management, optimizing the use of lithium, smoothing out potential supply bottlenecks. In the venue of sustainable practices, AI can also champion sustainable practices within the lithium supply chain. It can monitor environmental, social, and governmental standards, ensuring compliance and promoting the exploration of alternative materials that could mitigate the environmental impact associated with lithium extraction. So in summary, AI can have the potential to significantly mitigate the challenges associated with the growing demand of lithium.
So thank you for that. So I'm sensing the urge of the panelists to jump into the conversation of alternative fuels, but we can't leave EVs just yet. We have already a number of questions from our audience, and so I want to give other panelists an opportunity to jump in. Carlos, you're an obvious one to jump in on this conversation. What do you think about the transition to EVs?
Thank you, Cecilia. This is a fascinating discussion. And I would agree with Manal and Roberto that we should move away from a dogmatic thinking where one size fits all. I don't think this is going to work. What I would like to add is that the current EVs, and indeed they can be a solution for some of our societies, they need a very significant breakthrough in terms of chemistry. Right now, for a decent range, we are using 1,000 pounds, i.e. around 500 additional kilograms of raw materials to create a battery pack to move the vehicles. And of course, from an environmental standpoint, adding 1,000 pounds of additional raw materials doesn't look like a very reasonable outcome. So it's clear that the industry, based on new chemistries, needs to achieve in the next decade a breakthrough in terms of power density of the cells, so that we reduce by at least 50% the weight and the raw material usage of EVs. And I think that's on the way. I think over the next decade, we'll be able to reduce the battery pack weight by 50%, hence reducing by 50% the use of additional raw materials against a conventional vehicle. I think that is going to give, indeed, as Manal was mentioning, a better solution, a better direction to e-mobility. Right now, I don't think it makes sense to put 1,000 additional pounds of raw materials to have a distant range of 400 kilometers. But I think that paradigm is going to be broken over the next decade by a new chemistry, which, by the way, hopefully will solve the problem of the scarcity of lithium. This is my addition to this debate. Thank you.
So we've been talking a little bit around the lithium and things like that. But EVs, there was a question that comes up about range and really around infrastructure charging. So do we have adequate infrastructure to support this transition, even if the materials become more sustainable? Anyone have thoughts on what we think about the infrastructure investment that's required to support a shift to EVs? So I think, Carlos, I think you might have something more to say on that.
Well, the investment is huge, as we can understand. Just count the number of pumps you have right now in a gas station. Consider that charging an EV will take 3 or 4 more time, and therefore you just multiply by that factor all the filling stations, pumps that you have right now. So it's a very, very big investment, and it's more than that. What we have seen from the survey that was presented is people do not want to impact their convenience. And we have to find technologies and solutions that do not impact their convenience. That means that the charging network density needs to be highly visible. It needs to come your way instead of you looking for it, which means that when you go to university, when you go to the office, when you go to the restaurant, when you go to gym, when you go to the supermarket, you need to find those charging units in the parking lots, which then means a lot of investment, also a lot of carbon footprint. So I think this is one of the big challenges, is to make sure that those charging stations are visible, that they are accessible, and that the societies will not pay an enormous investment. That is, for me, an as big a challenge as the one we already have to reduce the weight of the EEs, without forgetting one thing that I didn't mention, is we have right now 1.3 billion internal combustion engine vehicles on the planet, 1.3 billion. And we are only talking about the 85 million new car sales of every year. We did not yet bring a solution, which may be e-fuels for the existing park, because we are not going to ask people to stop being mobile. That would not work, socially speaking.
Thank you. So Matthias, I think you want to jump in on the conversation as well. So Matthias, I'm going to ask you, we can't hear you just yet, so I'm going to go to Roberto really briefly, and then we'll come back to you, Matthias.
Yeah, just very briefly, we have to add to this problem the extra burden you're going to put in the power sector. So not only we have to have charging stations, but we have to put a lot of installed capacity to charge those cars. So this is an extra burden and extra investment need that we have to think about. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So let's see, Matthias, if we can get back to you again. We didn't hear you the last time. Let's see, do you want to jump in?
Sure, thank you very much.
Thanks.
So I want to bring in a perspective that questions the focus on technological solutions and electric mobility regarding the countries, the wealthy countries in the global north. And studies here are quite clear. the world cannot produce the amount of sustainable energy in time and provide all the necessary resources and materials for everyone globally to participate in the car-centered mobility regime of the US and Europe. This imperial mode of living, as it's called in the social sciences, relies on appropriation of resources and labor and on externalizing its cost. It cannot be universalized. And it's absurd that more than half of the new cars sold in countries such as Germany are actually SUVs. This is in the middle of the climate and biodiversity emergence. Instead of using the largest share of global resources to sell ever bigger and more comfortable electric cars to drive around the cities of Europe and other wealthy nations, I think climate justice actually demands using the resources where they are really needed for establishing transport infrastructures to realize the right for mobility for everyone in the global south. And a key precondition for this is not technological, but rather social, a paradigm shift to end car dependency in general.
Great, thank you for that. So I think we've done with our EV conversation, and I want to move on to where a few of you started beforehand. Let's take our second question that we've gotten from both the students and a number of our audience. How do we, and this is going to go to Carlos first, how do we make the transition to green hydrogen given the infrastructure required to produce it and the need for mobility vehicles to be able to use it? So you did talk about this transition and potentially some others, but Abir mentioned in her remarks that they believe that green hydrogen is next as a viable alternative. What do you think about that? Carlos, let's start with you.
Well, I think that hydrogen is based on the same solution as EVs in terms of getting a renewable energy and having a clean energy. Being for EVs as much as for hydrogen-based vehicles, you need clean energy so that you can produce that hydrogen. Of course, hydrogen is bringing much more convenience because it's much faster to charge, and it will be a little bit easier to package. But once you benefit from this convenience, and once you make the assumption that the energy that you are using to produce hydrogen is clean, you still have an enormous challenge of cost. Right now, we see that the technology for mobility hydrogen-based is twice more expensive as the electric vehicles, which then means that we are very far from the conventional technology. So I'm afraid that for the time being, affordability is going to be a major showstopper for hydrogen, but possibly for the fleets, for the big fleets that come to the garage every day, we can justify the investment of one hydrogen charging unit for big corporations, but still it's going to be far from being affordable. But it is much more convenient as you can charge a tank of hydrogen in approximately 3 to 4 minutes. So convenience is better, cost is sky high, and I think for the near future it's going to be a solution for fleet of big corporations, but certainly not for the normal citizens.
Thank you. And Roberto, I'd like you to jump in here because you started in your remarks earlier to talk about alternatives to EVs. So if we could talk about green hydrogen first and then potentially some of the other solutions that you think are appropriate, that'd be great.
Thank you, Cecilia. Very briefly, as of today, more than 90% of all hydrogen produced in the world is not green, comes from fossil fuels. So this is one important thing. When you talk about green hydrogen, we have to have in mind as well that we need more energy to produce hydrogen than the energy we have in a hydrogen itself. So from an energy perspective, it's really not a good solution. And also add to the fact that hydrogen is extremely dangerous. It's very dangerous to have hydrogen in a car because you do not see if the car is, let's say, if you have fire, explosion. So I don't think hydrogen is a solution for cars, except if you think about fuel cells using hydrocarbons from biofuels or even fossil fuels, where you produce hydrogen in the car, but not putting hydrogen in the car, in the gas station. So I think it's very problematic. Final comment, Cecilia, very briefly. We cannot fly an airplane from London to New York with hydrogen. The energy density of hydrogen is too low So you're going to use more space in the airplane to put hydrogen than to have space. So I don't think hydrogen is really a good solution, at least before 2050. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And now I'd like to ask Majora to jump into the conversation. Majora, we can't hear you right now. So.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
So anyway, I wanted to thank you all because this is such a fascinating discussion. But I kind of want to go back to something that Matthias had said, which is how do we bring this idea of community back into these discussions and making sure that we're keeping that front and center, because we know, bottom line is, if the economy had been clean and green a long time ago, if we had been building the kind of infrastructure, whether it's waste or energy or anything else, in higher status communities, but it hasn't been. And we now have an opportunity to rethink that as we're going forward. So that's really the thing that's coming to mind.
Yes, thank you for that. So any other conversation on alternative fuel? Matthias, how about you hop in?
I mean, thank you very much. I think just a very short thought, also coming from the debate we are having around this in Germany, where basically the electric car industry is quite advanced, and there's a lot more opportunity for universalizing electric mobility based on, or car mobility based on electric mobility than on other types of alternative fuels. There are still people advocating for alternative fuels, even though they're mainly used for basically racing cars or similar cars for the very rich. I think it's in actually addressing the overall challenge of climate change, we really need to focus on those solutions that can work in bringing mobility to the many, rather than on solutions that just work for the very, very few. One more thought on aviation. I think it's very important to also bring the question of aviation into the discussion. There is basically no technological solutions for decarbonizing aviation in time. So I think with regard to aviation, we really need to think about how we can change our social habits to make flying as necessary. There's no other way to decarbonize the entire mobility sectors without flying less. In particular, for the very rich are those who are currently those who are using most of the emissions for aviation.
Thank you for that. And Roberto, I want to ask you a specific question, because I think I heard you mention in an earlier conversation a piece around the infrastructure, the cars themselves, or the boats and the planes. If we talk about alternative fuels, what the challenge might be as we think about that transition. Can you make a comment on that?
Yes, and I'm going to connect with what was just said by Matthias. In fact, we have to think about if the crisis we're going through now means being net zero by 2050, we have to think about drop-in solutions for the short term. And in that case, if you talk about shipping or aviation, and even, let's say, we have to talk about road cars and buses, etc., the only solution we have on hand, and is well tested, is drop-in biofuels. We have today, let's say, in Central and Latin America, millions and millions of cars running on ethanol or green diesel, etc., etc. We also already have planes flying on alcohol-to-jet fuel. Also, we have ships running on biofuels. So I think it's not a solution for all, but as of today, for specific routes, specific places, biofuels is the only way to do the job before we think about new motorization and new fuels to solve the climate problem.
Thank you. Carlos, why don't you hop in and respond to that one?
Yes, I would like to share my perspective on what Roberto has just said. Indeed, ethanol-based fuel has proven to be a very good solution in Brazil, and I think it's one good solution. We need to also be mindful that at any point in time, biofuels cannot be opposed to food and to agriculture, because it needs also a significant amount of land to be grown. So ethanol-based fuels, biofuels is a good solution among the portfolio of solutions that pragmatically we need to use. And I agree that with a reasonable situation like we know today in Brazil, it works. And it works as well as an EV with a European energy mix. So the carbon footprint is quite efficient. It is one of the solutions we have. Nevertheless, if we were to think about other regions of the world, we would have to make sure that development is not going to oppose food production and agriculture production, because we also need that, of course, for the growing population on this planet. Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to move on to a new topic, similar in this same technology area that the students brought up. And again, we had questions from the audience on this related to the circular economy. So what can be done to move the mobility industry towards a more circular economy to reduce the consumption of natural resources and the generation of waste? So let's start with Matthias, if you want to hop in on this one.
Sure, thank you very much. I think this is definitely a key challenge, moving to circularity overall in the mobility sector. And probably the easiest or the most efficient way is to, and I'll talk about this later a bit more, to have less cars. I think this is one of the key preconditions for actually closing the circles to move towards public mobility, in particular in cities. Otherwise, I think it's very, very important to rethink the ownership models in the entire car industry to really enable consumers and the producers to close the circles full circle. But I think the idea that a circular economy can be fully closed and we thus prevent the overuse of resources, this is a false idea that will not work out. There's no full recycling. There's always some downcycling happening, and it's just not possible. So we also need to reduce the overall consumption of resources in the entire mobility sector. And this obviously raises important global justice challenges and demands us thinking about where to put the efforts in ramping up mobility and maybe also where this effort shouldn't go, in particular in those countries, as I mentioned before, where there's already a lot of mobility happening. So I think the overall consumption needs to be downscaled in terms of the resources used.
Great, thank you for that. And I think there's two questions that those comments raise that we've seen from some of the audience's questions as well. One is this idea, when you think about circular economy, we've got situations where vehicles that are produced in the global north, after they're old, they become exports into global south communities. Who would like to talk about the challenges that might actually present of moving cars that are 20 years old and having that be a primary source of mobility in the global south? I think, Roberto, I think you had some comments on that.
Yes, Cecilia, very briefly. I think by moving old cars to the global south, we are also moving the problem, one more problem to the global south. So I have to agree 100% with Matthias that the real solution for the circular economy, for materials consumption, is to reduce consumption. If a population of 8 billion people heading to 10 billion people, we cannot keep the same standards of living we have in the global north and try to reproduce that in the global south. Either we have to decrease the consumption in the global north to give more space to the global south, or we have to really rethink everything. It's not reasonable to think about, let's say, cars being sold every year and then you sell your car in 1 year time, 2 years time. So this is a problem that's goes far beyond the mobility problem. It's a consumption problem that we also have to address much better than we have been doing so far.
And Majora, I know that there's challenges when we think about recycling and circular economy. There's some implications in urban areas, for example. Why don't you share your perspective on this?
Yeah, and I need to sort of frame it within the context of a question to my esteemed panelists, because in part it is the communities, the lower status communities, that will be the ones who are dealing with whether they're lower status countries that are getting these old cars that are no longer of value here, but what we also, I think, need to get to the root of is how do we, do you think it's a policy issue or a policy question rather that will allow us to be able to literally limit the harm that our countries are doing? And like, I apologize on behalf of what America actually sends over to the global South. In terms of how do we create the type of literal whether they're regulations, could it be nudging, to help people see the value of it? This is more of a question to you all, like how do we get it so that there aren't eventually cars that are well past their prime even going to those places?
Yes, thank you for that. Somebody want to respond to that? Let's see, maybe Carlos? Oh, let's try that again. Can we try Carlos again?
Sorry,
Okay.
I was muted, of course. Thank you for the great question, Majora. I just would like to add, in the context of your question, a compliment to what Matthias said. Obviously, circular economy is not 100%, I would say, recycling and getting back all the materials, because you need energy for that, and energy potentially may not be totally clean. So circular economy is not the silver bullet, but circular economy has a huge potential to align all the stakeholders. It aligns the economic stakeholders, it aligns the consumers, and it can align the trends of the societies because it's not punitive. And we need to be very careful that if we want the support of everybody, and we need the support of everybody to get this done, we should favor policies, initiatives that are not punitive. And circular economy is certainly not punitive. It's going to move us away from excess of complexity. It's going to give us a good, positive conscience. It can be potentially very trendy, and it is going to align the interest of the economic sector with the citizens and the other stakeholders. So potentially, the circular economy is something that may align all the stakeholders, I would say, without so much effort and with a great benefit to the planet. So I'm very worried that we are going to move everything in the direction of regulations. And the more we go on the regulatory side, the more we may have pushback from the citizens and not a positive support to change the life in the communities, as you were mentioning a few moments before. So that's just my added comment to your great question. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Carlos. And as we think about wrapping up this first segment, we already see that looking at even something like a discussion around technology, that we've got lots of things to consider. One, there's a push today to move towards electrification of everything, and a push to have EVs become the primary solution to our mobility challenges. But from our discussion, we've already heard that there's concern with that. One, with what it does to our environment, and two, whether or not electric vehicles are actually affordable and accessible to all. As we think about alternative solutions in terms of fuels, there's lots of concern about how you make that transition, what is effective, and we see that there might not be a single solution for everything. And finally, as we think about things from a circular economy perspective, we've got to make sure that there's some equity in what we do with the resources, how we consume them, and perhaps the need to consume less so that we have less in circulation. So with that, let us now move on to the second part of this debate, the business dimension. Under the supervision of Pauline Leroy and Francois Gémen, the students from HEC explored innovative solutions in the business field to promote more sustainable transportation offers. They looked at the new business models that are emerging across the globe, offering mobility solutions that are more affordable, scalable, and sustainable. Representing HEC, I am pleased to welcome Sasha Krajcik.
Thank you, Cecilia. Mobility is central to our lives and makes up a significant portion of our carbon emissions. In France, the transport sector accounts for 29% of our GHG emissions, of which 53% are accounted for by personal vehicles. Besides, 41% of car trips are done with the driver alone. Tremendous emissions could be avoided by leveraging car sharing to minimize such trips. And this is just one of many examples which highlights the need to rethink our current mobility paradigm. As students in our 20s, we do not want less mobility, nor a certain form of sufficiency regarding our travels. And it's quite the opposite, as we want to be able to easily travel, to visit new cities, and to move around in our country and around the world. The disconnect between our current mobility models and the environmental and social urgency calls for a necessary mobility transition. We need to nudge individuals and consumers towards a different way of perceiving and consuming mobility. My team and I identified 3 areas of focus. First, the growing demand for services. Personal ownership of mobility devices is decreasing as consumers prefer solutions such as renting or leasing. And globally, the mobility as a service market, which represents a move towards service-based transportation, is expected to grow almost 4-fold in less than a decade, reaching $500 billion by 2030. This creates a huge opportunity to transform business models and value creation approach for both consumers and companies. We believe that innovative business models, which will make sustainable alternatives to private vehicle ownership more accessible and also financially attractive, will be the cornerstone of the transition. Second, we looked at intermodality. Tackling this issue is critical to the mobility transition because people want to be able to easily commute from point A to B, regardless of whether they start by renting a bike, then taking a train, and finally renting a car for the last part of the trip. Intermodality is key to facilitating sustainable mobility. And the third focus is the sharing economy. This will be central to accommodating the growing mobility needs of our planet, as it allows us to maximize and really optimize the use of existing transportation devices. The sharing economy allows us to do more commuting, more traveling with fewer resources, resulting in reduced environmental impact and an enhanced mobility accessibility. So to tackle the needed mobility transformation, leaders of the mobility ecosystem must rethink how they create value, both economically and for society, shifting the focus from ownership of mobility devices to the use of mobility services. So how willing are companies, public leaders, civil society to collaborate to rethink the value equation and design the right mobility ecosystem, one tailored to local constraints and opportunities?
Thank you for those questions, Sasha, and for that wonderful research. Can you please kick off this round with your question for Matthias?
Yes. Our research suggests that a shift in demand from owning mobility assets, such as cars, to buying mobility services is underway. So what does the mobility sector need to do to prepare themselves for the shift in their business model?
Yeah, thank you very much for this very interesting analysis and the important questions. And building on this, I actually thought I want to talk about the elephant in the room for sustainable transportation. Electric cars, car sharing, intermodality, and sustainable business models, they are all great, but they're not enough, especially in developed countries. I think the true challenge is reducing car dependence and also reducing the number of cars. Research shows achieving climate targets in wealthy nations will only be possible if most transports shifts to public forms of collective mobility, in particular in cities and suburban areas. Overcoming car dependence means giving public space back to other mobility modes, from affordable and convenient trains to trams to bicycles and buses. Redesigning our cities to make this possible, and it means curbing the overconsumption of mobility by the rich. You might ask, why this focus on sufficiency and less? Firstly, studies show that mobility is the most unequal form of energy use. Large cars, frequent trips, and constant flying create a massive burden. The top 1% of global emitters were responsible for nearly a quarter of the total growth in pollution between 1990 and 2019. And a large part of this is due to transport emissions. Secondly, most efficiency improvements by the car industry, also the growth of the sharing industry, are in fact cancelled out by more cars driving longer distances. This is called the rebound effect in economics research. And third, while new technologies are key, they are not the main challenge. We urgently need to shift the debate, also I think the debate here, from focusing mainly on technological innovations and new business models to one focusing on the need for systemic infrastructure changes and social innovations that lead to reductions in overall demand for transport services. This is the real challenge. And even the IPCC acknowledges this need for demand management and sufficiency. So basically the bottom line, sustainability means that companies need to produce and sell not just different cars, but eventually also less cars, at least in wealthy countries. We need thriving public transport, car-free cities, and functioning public mobility services. Also in the countryside, obviously, some cars. But overall, this means less cars. That's the true paradigm shift. And I want to end this with a question, also maybe to Carlos. What if there is no sustainable business case for car manufacturers? Basically, no way to continue making profit while not further transgressing planetary boundaries. What would you do then?
So Carlos, you want to jump in on that one?
Well, that's a great question. First of all, Matthias, I could agree with many things you said, but I think there is one thing you need to think about is how you get the support of the people to get the transformation that you were describing done. I think all of the things that you would like to do need the support of the people. And perhaps not everybody is as conscious as you are vis-à-vis the problem that we are trying to fix. So please think about how to change the lifestyle of people with their support. And of course, you mentioned that, and I think it is absolutely correct. There is a big difference between the urban areas and the rural areas, very complete different kind of lifestyles and problems. But I would like to come back to what was said by our friend from HEC in Paris. We have recently bought from two German car makers a car sharing business, and we tried to run this car sharing business at zero, which means no profit. It was very hard because it was making a significant amount of losses, and that's why the two German car makers sold it to us, and we fixed it. Now it's fixed, and we have 50% market share of the car sharing services in Europe right now. What did we learn from that? We learned that there are 4 conditions to improve the sustainability of this car sharing, which I believe is a good step in the right direction, as we can, of course, use zero-emission vehicles for that specific service that was requested by the next generation. First, we need free parking from the cities, which should not be a problem, but actually it is right now. We need competitive energy, which should not be a problem. Actually, it is with the local town halls. We need a reasonable insurance, which should not be a problem, but actually it is, because we have a lot of destruction problems and lack of security in the urban areas where the cars get significantly damaged. At the end of the day, it would be absolutely possible very, very quickly to have a very sustainable, very cost competitive car sharing, zero emission service in the urban areas, and that's what we are doing with 50% market share. If we were able to convince our political leaders and the town halls of our cities to provide parking, competitive energy, reasonable security, so that the insurance fees would be cost competitive. With those three conditions, we can do a great service to the young generation in terms of mobility. But as you mentioned, it is mostly focused on the cities. And the last comment I would share with you is very simple. Today, we are making cars, but we are trying to deliver freedom of mobility to our citizens. And as it was said by Cecilia, a freedom of mobility that is safe, clean, and affordable. Tomorrow, if you want us to do something else, just let us know. We are here to serve. We are not addicts to cars. We are just here to serve the needs of mobility from our citizens. And if you prevent the citizens from being mobile, I think you are going to face a certain number of issues on your side. Thank you.
So thank you for that, Carlos. And I think in this conversation, we keep coming back to it could be affordable. We've got to work together. We talk about all the different players that need to work together. Roberto, when we think about some of these solutions, there's a major cost, particularly an infrastructure cost, that someone has to pay for us to make this shift. So what's your take on that aspect?
Thank you, Cecilia. This comes back to some issues that I have already raised. If you were to make major investments in terms of infrastructure, I don't think that investment should focus on private vehicles. We have to think about a widespread dissemination of public transportation where public transportation does not exist. We have to have major investments in infrastructure for intermodality where it does not exist. I don't think we have to have major investments to provide more mobility for those that already have a lot of mobility. So that's why I'm a little bit disappointed to hear that our colleagues from France in their early 20s, they're thinking about more mobility and not less mobility. They want to fly more. It's impossible for a world with 8 billion people. If everyone wants to fly more, we're not going to make it. We have to think about flying less. So I think the real issue here is how to invest in public transportation, intermodality, and for that we need new business models. We don't need new business models for private ownership of cars. This is not the reality of the world. As of today, we have 1.6 billion cars in the world. 2/3 of that are only in 4 places: Europe, US, China, and Japan. The rest of the world does not have access to private mobility. We have to have major investments in public transportation.
Thank you for that. Majora, why don't you jump in on this conversation?
Sure. I mean, I'm just thinking about, okay, the echo's really bad in my ear. So sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're good.
Perfect. Okay, great. So what I'm struck by is that I think we need both a carrot and a stick approach to this idea, because it's not going to be business is going to save us, but they can certainly help. And sometimes it means that you have to stop things before they get going. Like, I'm just thinking of one of my heroes, Enrique Peñalosa, in Bogota, Colombia, and how, basically, since he knew that so much of the city's infrastructure was going specifically to support wealthy car owners, which was a minority of people in Bogota, and so what he did was outlaw cars. I mean, literally parking on some of the major streets. That actually created a whole another type of business, which was private parking. It's like, you want your car? Fine, you pay for your car. But we, as a city, we should not have to be paying for all of that comes from having your car stolen or paying for your parking and all sorts of things. So again, inconveniencing folks a little bit also created a business, but then he was able to pump a lot of money specifically into ciclovia, or bus traffic transit and greenway infrastructure for the bulk of the people that lived in Bogota that were making less than $2 a day. Like, that is the kind of both public, private, beautiful things that actually can help create the kind of nudges that can produce behavioral change, but also can produce business change. And I think we have to be a lot more creative about thinking about what are new opportunities that could be out there that are sitting right in plain sight, that literally make it so that we're the ones pushing the ideas and also policies that they can be much more transformative into a much more sustainable energy and transportation economy for all.
Thank you for that. So, Majora, you're the second person in this segment to talk about changing people's behaviors. So we've got a great question that came up around, and Matthias, you mentioned this earlier, the rebound effect. So what can be done to manage people's tendency to cancel out the environmental gains by consuming more transportation services as they observe each trip's decreased sustainability impact? So, Roberto, why don't you take that one, since you did comment about our need for less flying and things of that nature. Why don't you start us off on that one?
Yeah, this issue of the rebound effect is really a problem that has been studied for many years now. As we make things cheaper, more accessible, we create demand. And again, we have to have in mind that the big picture here is that we have a climate emergency here. Would be great if everyone could fly more, travel more, eat more, to have a private car, bigger and bigger. But this is not the reality of the world today. We're talking about a world that is heating up, major disruptions in cities, agriculture, poor people. They are going to be the ones that are going to be most affected. So it's very complicated to think about a solution to improve the life of those that already have a good life, and creating problems that those that have never benefited from that good life. So that's why we have been so critical about this issue of mobility. The real problem of mobility is the mobility poverty in some places, and not, let's say, making life easier for those that already have easy access for the private car. Private cars have to be end in the very short term, and we really have to think about public transportation, because more and more populations are moving to big cities where we are not going to have space for cars, etc. So again, I think the real discussion here is how to solve the transportation problem and not to provide more cars for people.
So, Manal, there's an opportunity to think about educating people. So one of the things from a rebound effect is people maybe not understanding the breadth of the impact that they may be having on the environment. How do we think that AI solutions might help along those dimensions?
First of all, I would like to mention kind of a new business model that could be adopted in terms of mobility where AI can play a big role to enhance all the mobility needs of the 8 billion people inhabitants. So if we think as mobility as a service platforms that combine multiple modes of mobility into one platform, where users can whenever they want to make a journey, AI can optimize the journey and provide the optimal modes of transportation that they should take in order to complete that journey, and also displaying perhaps the carbon footprint of their choices within that platform. So AI can, in this case, provide accessibility to optimal journeys and pathways and modes of communication to users at any point in time. AI can integrate data from various sources into the platform, from traffic data to weather data to even real-time data from other users, and optimize for any particular user the mobility option that he or she can take in order to complete that journey. So in that case, people may automatically opt away from using their private cars and prefer to use a platform that facilitates or personalizes experiences for them, right? So instead of forcing people not to use their private cars or stopping manufacturing cars, we should provide them with better options, right? Better options within these platforms that also integrate green technologies, electric vehicles, bikes, ride shares, taxis, public transportation. And with the availability of these platforms, we will be able to gather tremendous amount of data from all the users of the platform. So we will have valuable mobility data that will inform policymakers to improve infrastructure, where AI can use in order to prioritize availability of services to certain regions where high demand is available. So automatically, the availability of the big data and with the integration of the AI technologies, we will be able to improve the accessibility to mobility to everybody, and ultimately reduce the carbon emissions and allow for more sustainable solutions, and guide people towards picking the right options in terms of mobility solutions rather than simply imposing it on them.
So thanks for that, Manal. You bring up this point of intermodality, and I want to get to that in a moment, but I want to give Matthias an opportunity. Since you brought up the rebound effect, I want to give you an opportunity to elaborate on this topic a bit. Matthias?
Yeah, thank you very much. Just very shortly, I think ultimately the solution to rebound effects kicking in is to impose some form of limits. And I think we often think of limits as something negative, but we can also see limits as a project of collective self-determination, where we as humanity give ourselves limits that enable long-term thriving on this planet. And I think this is key on many dimensions, and we like to make it very concretely. I think, for example, for the issue of airplanes, we need to start with bans on certain types of technologies, for example, private jets, and working our way from there towards a general reorganization of the entire mobility sector. So firstly, addressing the excessive overconsumption by the very few and very rich, and then working our way towards more general forms of setting limits. And I think this could also be forms of limits on the size of cars that are normally allowed in cities, then maybe also creating more inner cities and then also entire cities where there's no cars allowed except for people who really need a car. But most of us could also be mobile without cars. And I think without limits, ultimately, rebound effects cannot be solved.
So very, very interesting perspective, Matthias, and thinking about those of us who really need cars. Carlos, why don't you jump into this discussion?
Well, thank you. I just would like to come back to what Manal was saying. When we see the capacity utilization rate of public transportation from one side, from the other side, the potential of car sharing and mobility services platforms, I do totally agree on the fact that we can improve with her comment enormously the way we are using those assets. The way we are using those assets is by far not optimal. And we can just through the crunching of data understand where those capacities should be put, in which area, at which time window should be using these tools to understand where the mobility need is, and therefore optimizing significantly not only the convenience, but also, of course, the emissions. And we have all seen many buses almost empty, making tours where there is nobody inside. We have seen crowded buses. We have seen everything. All of this just demonstrates that the assets that we already have are not being properly used in terms of capacity to maximize the convenience and reduce the emissions. So completely agree with Manal on the artificial intelligence potential. I think this is a very big direction for optimization on those mobility needs without emissions. Thank you.
So Carlos, a follow-up to this, and this is for you or whomever wants to jump in here. We are talking about public transportation, and we've had it for a while, yet we still have the issue that you just brought up about underutilized and inefficiently utilized assets. Has public transportation worked? And what are we going to do to make that work as a solution for the future? So, Carlos, if you want to jump in.
That's a striking point you are making, Cecilia. If I may comment that, if public transportation was the right answer, and it may be, I'm not saying it's not, the question is, why didn't it work over the last 70 years? Why didn't public transportation work over the last 70 years? Because many attempts have been made, many investments have been made, many cities have tried, but most of them are failed. So it is true that the only thing that is new in the way we are using those assets right now is artificial intelligence. That is really new. that can really bring a different access in the way we are understanding the needs of the people and the way we are crunching the data and understanding where we should put the capacity and when to optimize convenience and reduce emissions. What is striking for me is that public transportation is something that we have been highlighting for the last 70 years. Yet, people still prefer to use their cars. So from one side, we have the capacity utilization, which is not optimal. From the other side, we have the security, the perceived security, and also the convenience. That's why I don't think that this can only be solved with regulations. I think it has to be a global social direction that everybody agrees on, and that we find the reasonable, good sense thing to do.
So thank you for that. And Matthias, why don't you hop in on this question as well?
Sure, thanks. So one point, public transportation works in many places. It does work very well. It doesn't work in other places, also because of many factors, but one factor is also the deliberate efforts by the car industry in the beginning of the 20th century to actually dismantle the existing public transportation system to create a market for their product. So I think we have to be quite honest about the real interests behind creating a car culture that has become hegemonic in our societies, where most people associate a good life with owning a private car. And I think this is not the real need people have is a need for mobility, not a need for a car. And this is a cultural shift that we need to address in order to enable this shift towards public transportation. And there's great examples in many European cities where public transportation does actually work for many and could work much better if there would even be less cars and there's more public space that people can actually start to reclaim their cities and for their communities, as Majora has already highlighted.
So thank you for that. It sounds like you are in agreement with Sasha on the idea of the young generations are not necessarily looking for car ownership, but for mobility. Majora, why don't you hop in on this as well?
Not agree with you more, and thank you for actually adding context and research to it, because I can see anecdotally how so much transit is not invested in. It's actually starting to become a thing here, in the States, as sort of transit-oriented development, for which I am utterly delighted. But, the same way that there was a marketing play, back when the cars were just like, look, we're going to be king. Literally communities were destroyed in the States and actually all over the world in order to make room for highways so that cars could drive on them. If that isn't an example of the kind of, like really bad practices, like creating policies that people have to deal with, I don't know what is. So I think the same thing can be said for how do we kind of make it so that that transit culture is something that we look forward to. As opposed, because how could that help us start to see that this is how we experience the great wide open. This is how we experience connectivity with people and within other parts of the world, even sometimes within our own communities. It is much about marketing. But it's about producing the behavioral change that makes people feel like this is what we need to see. It is. I think we have done really a very bad job of making transit attractive. I mean, I'll give you a silly little example, but on our regional rail system, we used to have a bar car, so you can get a drink on the way back and forth to wherever you're for home to your business. They don't have them anymore. I would personally think it'd be kind of great to have a bar car when I'm traveling out to my school to go where I teach, which is an hour away on transit. So I'm just saying it would be lovely.
Great, thank you for that. And you said that the move to put the highways in and support the car culture was a bad example. Maybe it's a good example of how to get your point across. Maybe if we take some of those tips and apply them to another objective, maybe. Roberto, how about you hop in on this one?
Yeah, very briefly, just to add to the discussion. Let's say over the past 50 years, we have been giving much more support to private cars than to public transportation. The more roads you build, the more the more parking lots you build, you create demand for the use of private cars. And once you have that in place, you do not go back. Let's take the example of the US. It's very hard for you to arrive in the US in an airport and have public transportation to go downtown. It's not the reality of Europe. So why, let's say, you have public transportation in Europe and you don't have that in the US? This has very much to do with the importance of the car industry in the US over time. So it's not true that public transportation does not work. What's true is that not too many incentives have been given to public transportation and a lot of incentives to private cars.
Perfect. Thank you for that. And I want to briefly touch, because you all talked about it or around it. We did have some questions around this on the intermodality. So the question that we have is, what types of solutions can be devised to integrate the planning of trips that require the use of more than one mode of transportation to get from door to door? So, if you think about, Roberto, you just said, when I fly somewhere, then how do I get the rest of the way? So whether it's bikes, cars, planes, trains, automobiles, how do we actually think about the connectivity and the intermodality? I'll start with Matthias. Why don't you kick us off on this one?
Sure, thank you. So I would again put this in the context of a well-functioning public transportation system. And I think for this, there's a lot of need for investment. I don't think we know yet what a well-functioning, affordable public transportation system could look like that integrates intermodality, in particular regarding bikes. I think we have to be a bit careful about some of the newer solutions, such as the electric rollers that are congesting cities, are not really sustainable in terms of the resource use, only lasting on average 1 year. So I think there's also some false solutions in this under this aspect of intermodality, but integrating public transportation systems with well-functioning, you can take your bike, there's also public bikes for rent in the city, and integrating this with systems of car sharing in the suburban area and outside of the cities, in the context of some publicly provided right to mobility. I think this would be a good framework in which to discuss intermodality. On the other hand, we have to be careful. There's lots of efforts at the moment, I think, to create new markets for products in the niches of where people are currently using public transport and are then using some private services such as these rollers for the last mile that are actually not really beneficial for the entire communities, but rather a new business case. So there's some dangers, but I think there's great potential here as well.
Thank you for that. So as we wrap this segment up, there are a few things that I've heard us talk about. One, we said that we need to think broader than just cars. We understand that we have a car culture that has dominated the way we've made investments in the past, and it has dominated the culture and how citizens think about what their modes of transportation will be. If we are going to achieve more sustainable and affordable and accessible mobility for all, we're going to need to think of a broader set of solutions than just a car-dependent society. When we think about public transportation, it has worked in some areas, but not in others. Perhaps because it's not effective and we might use some AI and things like that to optimize it. But perhaps it's because we haven't marketed it and we haven't chosen to focus on that as a viable alternative solution. What's clear is that solutions that come out today, there may be confusion around whether or not they really are sustainable. And we've got a responsibility to think more critically about the options that we provide, how we inform people about the decisions they make, and where we invest our time, dollars, and resources in how we move. With that, let's move on to our third and last sequence. Under the supervision of Joel Kutcher-Gershenfeld, the students from Brandeis looked at the human side of the equation. They looked at the reality of climate change increasingly challenges on our lifestyle, our mobility habits, and exacerbating the existing inequalities. Large disparities exist between countries, regions, and communities regarding accessibility to transport, with some individuals unable to escape the hazardous effects of climate change or access their essential needs. Representing Brandeis, I am pleased to welcome Amanda Yu.
Thank you, Cecilia. In her 1988 song, Fast Car, American singer-songwriter Tracy Chapman opens with the following lyrics. You've got a fast car, and I want a ticket to anywhere. Maybe we can make a deal. Maybe together we can get somewhere. Any place is better. Starting from zero, got nothing to lose. Maybe we'll make something. Me, myself, I've got nothing to prove. Chapman sings about a yearning for social mobility and hope for a better life, facilitated by that eponymous fast car. Her song has had a recent rediscovery, and its message of struggle and hope continues to resonate. Despite enormous economic growth and immense technological change, the challenges we faced nearly 40 years ago have not changed. When I listen to Fast Car, I think about my own story of mobility, generations of immigrants fleeing oppression and making sacrifices so that their children could have better lives. I am grateful for the opportunities their sacrifices bestowed on me, but I worry that those opportunities are rapidly disappearing. In many ways, the world has never been more mobile. We can fly across the globe, have an electric car drive us to work, and even travel to outer space. This kinetic freedom is, however, restricted to the privileged mobile elite. The UNDP reports that 45% of the global population struggles to access essential healthcare due to transportation limitations, with over 1 billion people lacking access to all-weather roads, exacerbating societal inequalities. Social mobility is limited globally. An OECD study suggests that it could take 150 years for a child from a poor family to reach their country's average income. The freedom of mobility is a facade, available to the wealthy and denied to billions across the globe. As economic inequality rises, opportunities like my family's are becoming fewer and farther between. The hope for a better life that Chapman sang about is at risk. Our research team grappled with a paradox. Lifestyle is a function of the choices people make, but those choices aren't always equally available to all. There are structural and societal barriers that mean you can't just select a lifestyle. The climate crisis worsens this existing barriers, disproportionately affecting those least responsible for unsustainable consumption. Rising inequality and increasing xenophobia coincide with a growing global displacement crisis. Currently, an estimated 110 million people are displaced worldwide, a figure expected to escalate because of climate change. Despite these barriers, we also see opportunities for transformation and a chance to rethink mobility in ways that reverse disparities and pioneer a better future for us all. There is an opportunity to rebalance our society and ecosystem, but we need to find a way to inspire politicians, industry, and citizens to collaborate to advance mobility solutions that promote positive societal changes. So I ask you, think about the journey and the sacrifices that your forebears made. How are they able to advance social mobility to enable you to be here today? Do you think they could have made that journey in our current world? And what do you think we need to do today to enable that kind of mobility for future generations?
Thank you, Amanda, for that challenging presentation and your questions. Will you please kick us off with your question for Majora?
Hi, Majora. Many people have least resourced communities and countries to pursue better opportunities elsewhere. How do we continue to enable this kind of mobility freedom? And how can mobility strategies provide opportunities within the communities they leave?
Wow. Well, thank you, Amanda, number one, for evoking Tracy Chapman, always a good thing. And that's how much that song actually meant to me when I was coming up in my own community, and it was all about trying to leave to get out. So thank you for the segue. But the first part of your question actually reminds me of a Toni Morrison quote, another great American sage. Utopias are defined by the people who are not allowed in. Because when many people think of the freedom of mobility, images of a utopia with driverless electric cars and other symbols belonging to the wealthiest among us come to mind. However, improving local economic mobility within low-status communities is my version of utopia. I describe what you refer to as less resourced or poor communities from which people are trying to leave as low status. These are the places all around the world where schools, public health, air and water quality, food options, and career and lifestyle opportunities are worse than in other parts of the same town. Inequality is assumed by those in and outside of those places. Many of us from low status communities measure our success by how far we get away from those communities where we were raised. Increasing the freedom to leave may be good for some individuals, but it's an extractive ideal that takes the local talent out. And when people like this continue to leave, they take their history, their culture, consumer spending, long-term financial acumen, and their positive influence on their own community away from the places that need them the most. That result is statistically, it's concentrated poverty and an even greater desire to leave. We know mobility technology will improve to become cleaner and more accessible. We know that. But if history is any guide, low status communities will continue to be developed in ways that repel that talent instead of retaining it. Could mobility innovations be used to help solve issues of inequality? Could retaining more of the talent in low status communities be an important part of that solution? I think so. For example, as we convert to electric vehicle power, I don't understand all the conversations we had about that, but with so much less noise and pollution, honestly, in urban areas, it could become much nicer to live in areas where there are expressways. However, since most expressways, at least in the States, are built in lower status communities, and that's where, the poor, the people of color, that's where they were stuck and had to be, suddenly, because there's less noise and pollution, it might not be so bad to live near there, right? So the people who live there currently would benefit in the short term, but not for long, if they are renters or unaware of how to keep their property as it increases in value, thus increasing their family's generational wealth. Can we act so we can drastically reduce displacement and gentrification that usually comes with new development? Mobility's great benefit can be used to keep people happy and healthy wherever they are, and actually be used to support and develop low status communities into much more economically mobile places that actually allow people to pursue their version of the American dream. Really, all that it means is that we can actually use mobility as a way to help people understand they don't have to move out of their neighborhoods to live in better ones.
Great, thank you for that, Majora. And Carlos, although you're the CEO of an automobile manufacturer, I believe you have some strong opinions on the human element and the global inequalities that exist. Will you chime in on this one?
Absolutely. And it's true that in this case, the case that was so brilliantly described by Majora, we are not talking about mobility. We are talking about inequalities and misery, and how we move out of misery and poverty inequalities, which is a very different topic from mobility. One experience I can share, having the privilege of having created many plants across the world, and many plants in places where there was a lot of poverty. When I look back at what has happened around some of those plants, it is quite clear that at least 3,000 to 5,000 families were able to move out of poverty because of those plants because of those manufacturing activities. So whatever we talk about, cars, mobility, devices, whatever you want to pick, it is clear that if we want to address the inequality and the poverty drama that was described, you need to create value somewhere in that community so that people do not need to leave the community. So the real question is, how do you create value in the community for people to step out of poverty and make sure that they can have a good life in the community with no pollution, no noise, and everything that was mentioned? I think that's the real question. In this case, mobility is not the solution. Mobility is just one of the components of the life of those people. And the manufacturing that could be connected to mobility may be a very good lever to create value. And I could present many cases around the world in very high poverty areas where creating that activity moved a significant number of families out of poverty, increased education, increased healthcare, increased quality of life. So we cannot just focus on mobility. Mobility is not the driver here. Mobility may be one way to create activity and high added value and good paid jobs and to move people out of poverty. But mobility is not the key solution for this problem.
Thank you for that. Majora, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, it will have to be that a level of attention that recognizes that, yeah, we can create the kind of access to opportunity using mobility, both literally and figuratively, as a way to support these communities that have traditionally only been almost used as the collateral damage of getting business done. And being very deliberate about it and recognizing that we can't undo the historic harms that happens as a result of much of the business practices that are the underpinning of our global economy. But we can recognize that we don't have to continue doing it the same way, because what we've often seen is that the places where whether it's energy was extracted, or mined or whatever, or products are built, that those areas have also, been devastated in some way, shape, or form. We now have technology and even then we had some technology and just didn't have to do things as disgustingly as we did. We can do things differently now. And I think, but again, we as business leaders have to understand that we need to put that out first and foremost. I think we can't pretend that it's just, this is just the way that we have to do things, because it's never is. Maybe our bottom lines will have to be cut a little bit. I don't know exactly how it's going to go, but I think, ultimately we've got to acknowledge that we'd like to move in a different direction and put the money behind it to make it happen.
Thank you. So Majora mentioned technology. So Manal, I want to give you an opportunity to talk about how we might actually think about technology, whether it's automation or other forms of technology that might actually support increased access to opportunities, social mobility, physical mobility, however we like to define mobility. What role do you think technology can play in that?
Well, AI's massive ability to analyze data allows us to predict occupancy rates, for example, in rural areas, predict demand in those areas, and accordingly allocate resources to those locations. So one thing I'd like to also mention to Carlos is that, of course, the availability of businesses in certain areas will return with economic growth to those locations. However, without mobility solutions, businesses would not go and actually be built up in those areas. So mobility is required in order for businesses to flourish. They are a precursor for economic growth for especially left out areas. And AI can actually predict, the occupancy rate, as I said, the demand on those areas, and accordingly, policymakers can allocate infrastructure budgets in order to improve infrastructure, in order to reach those areas. We can also build a smart infrastructure that alleviates a pressure over the infrastructure of demanding mobility. So AI can actually be used in many ways in order to improve access of mobility to these regions.
Thank you. And so we've been talking about this topic from a perspective that I take as could be urban areas, again, in the global north primarily. What about how this entire conversation applies to the global south? Roberto, do you want to share some perspectives? And I think about the global south and rural areas everywhere. How do we think about this issue in those geographies?
Thank you, Cecilia. In fact, let's say we are broadening the concept of mobility here. We're talking about social mobility, but this real issue, let's say, the mobility poverty is a real issue that somehow precludes people to move, let's say, in their social mobility trend. I don't know how many of you know of that, but many people in the global south, they have jobs, but because of, let's say, lack of transportation, or because transportation is too expensive, they sleep on the streets during the week, and only go back home on the weekends because they cannot afford the mobility cost of going back home every day. So for sure, let's say the physical mobility is one of the prerequisites for social mobility as well. So that's why, let's say, we have to address very seriously the issue of mobility poverty, because by addressing this issue, we are also addressing the issue of social mobility, because with more mobility, people can have access to better jobs, better quality of life, do not spend so much time on the transportation, do not get so tired, etc., etc. So I think it's a key issue to improve mobility so that this can greatly facilitate social mobility as well.
Thank you for that. So I've got another question from our audience. Really want to talk about the affordability. We're talking about social mobility. So there's a question from the audience that says, when we say that freedom of mobility, how do we make it affordable for marginalized people? Let's see. How about Carlos? You start us on this one.
Well, there are a lot of ways to make it affordable. The first thing I think we should mention is that we don't have to create mobility devices as we usually create cars. There are two very concrete examples that I can mention that we call mobility devices. It's not about cars. It's about a specific niche of regulations where you can make mobility devices which are 1/3 of the usual car footprint, of course, zero emission, that you can use downtown, and you can just look for it. It's the Fiat Topolino and the Citroën Ami. It's a two-seater, and you can drive around. It's 1/3 of the footprint. It's totally electric, and of course, it's very cheap, because you have to pay a monthly fee, which is the same as a mobile phone. So it's the same magnitude as the monthly fee of a mobile phone. So it's reasonably affordable. That's one way. Of course, it moves around many of the regulations that have been piling up over the last decades on cars, on traditional cars. That's one way. The other way is to make sure that we use technologies that have been fully depreciated and clean, like the ethanol-based mobility that Roberto was mentioning, which is one of the most affordable ones that currently exist and the cleanest one. And of course, we are, as an industry, right now struggling to make electromobility affordable, which is not. It's 40% more expensive than the conventional one. And it will take some time to break a certain number of paradigms to make sure that we bring the EVs to a level of affordability that at least the middle class is able to pay for. So that's some of the directions in which we are moving. And I'm not even talking about public transportation. I'm sure that my teammates will talk about it much better than I do. But there are a certain number of solutions that are already existing. But it's clear that the EV technology is certainly going the wrong way in terms of affordability, and we have been explaining that for a while. It will take some time to make that clean mobility affordable. And as we know, in Asia, we can find much more cost competitive solutions right now on the basis of that same technology, which means that the Western world that Matthias knows very well is going to be facing a very significant change, a Darwinian change in terms of manufacturing footprint, starting with Germany, but also the Western world. And we'll see how our societies are going to react to that.
Thank you. So Matthias, I'm sure you have, based on your earlier comments, I'm sure you have a perspective on this one. Why don't you jump in?
Sure. Thank you very much. Maybe I start with a more general point on the, I think, very good input that Amanda and the students brought in of bringing extreme inequality into this conversation, which I think is very important. So the numbers are quite clear. The richest 1% of the world's population produced as much carbon pollution as in 1 year as the poorest 2/3 of humanity. And a large part of this is due to transportation emissions, aviation, road transport in particular. So we thus need to link poverty and inequality with the effects of transportation emissions by the very rich. So I think we cannot really distinguish the two topics here, as Carlos has tried to separate them, but they are very much interlinked, in particular due, on the one hand, due to the effects the imperial mode of of living and the car industry has through the emissions, the very high emissions globally. We tend to talk about climate change as this very abstract topic, but there are studies showing that these outsized emissions of the 1%, the top 1% of the global emitters, they will be responsible for 1.3 million heat-related deaths until 2030, so in the next years. So this is very concrete outcomes of how high emissions in the global north, partly also created by the car industry, is responsible for creating inequality, exacerbating inequality, creating desperate situations in the global south. Then there's another issue, which is around all the sacrifice zones that are currently created for the production of supposedly green energy and green the mining of the resources necessary for these green solutions. This is also a key issue where at this moment there's inequality, new types of inequalities created in forms that some of the people on the ground label as green forms of colonialism, new forms of green colonialism that are created by the efforts to transform the car industry in the global north without taking into account the global effects of this. So I think we need to address this issue of inequality globally, which I think in the end boils down to achieving global justice means degrowth for some, so less for some, to enable human flourishing for the many. I think without bringing this perspective in, we are losing sight of the bigger challenges that are facing this entire conundrum of how to provide mobility, also social mobility, which is in effect much more important for many people than the question of car ownership or getting from A to B.
Thank you. Majora, we talked about green colonialism. Do you want to provide a perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's another example of how much will continue, to socialize the actual costs and the costs of inequality, in particular, as we privatize the profits. And we can continue doing that. And I think the history of environmental inequality kind of speaks to that. And just the way that capitalism works speaks to that as well. How do you, but first again, I think we have to acknowledge that the same thing will happen, even if it's got a nice little green color on it. It's still going to be people who are going to be suffering the inequalities that are traditionally reserved for the poorer and the darker in the world are going to be exacerbated yet again, unless we literally go, we're going to make some changes here. Like, one of the reasons why, the car is king and still is, and I think it's the same, in the EU as well. But the kind of subsidies that the oil and gas industry continues to get, the kind of subsidies that are literally supported by policymakers, to continue to build more roads as opposed to more transit. Just that level of detail, which is often unfortunately lost on many people, and even pundits and even some people that are out there do mean really well. Some of them do anyway. We don't really acknowledge that that's a thing that we have to deal with. So I'm always of the mind of that if we don't acknowledge it, and if we're not actually making those moves to say, what, we can do better because we can, then we're going to continue to sort of socialize those costs, and we're going to keep paying them over and over and over again.
Thank you for that. So I'm going to give one of our students a chance to jump in. Sasha, I think you wanted to respond to something that Roberto said a little bit ago.
Yes, thank you. So yes, it was something that Roberto mentioned, and also Matthias. It was regarding sufficiency and regarding also degrowth in the travels. What we've been thinking and what we've been looking at in our research is that the sufficiency that we're not looking at is that in terms of, for example, public transport, in terms of green transportation, well, our world is super interconnected. And we want to easily be able to go from one city to another, and to easily be able to do all that. And we don't really foresee a future where we have to take less means of transportations, green means of transportation. I'm not talking about flying every weekend to go all around the world, but in terms of sustainable ways of transportation, we don't really see that being an area where we could reduce or where we could have more sufficiency in.
Great. Thank you for that. Roberto, do you have a comment?
No, just I fully agree with what you're saying, Sasha. The problem is, again, we have 8 billion people in the world, and this standard of consumption will not be available to everybody. So you have to have this in mind. Let's say that there are a few people that can do everything they want, even in a cleaner way, but most of the people will never do what the global north can do today. This is a problem, and we have to think about how to solve that issue.
Okay, thank you for that. So I want to go to another question from our audience. We've talked a bit about car makers are doing what they can. Carlos, you mentioned if you are asked to do something different, you will. So there is a concern about the role that the business community plays in driving consumer preferences. And so the question is there a way that the business community can support driving consumer preference for things such as smaller EVs, local goods, less consumption, things of that nature, public transportation, or are they merely at the whim of the consumers? So Carlos, can you start us off on that question?
Sure, absolutely. I think we can. Of course, everybody will consider that we are not doing enough, but let me just point out a few things. And I'm not in a position here to be the lawyer or supporting the industry. I'm just sharing with you my observations. First of all, you mentioned, Cecilia, that Stellantis will become a carbon neutral corporation by 2038 with a one-digit compensation, which means 90% CO2 emissions against 2021 by 2038, plus one-digit compensation. To the best of my knowledge, there is no Western country right now that is going to be carbon neutral before 2050. So I think we need to recognize that. We need to recognize, number one, it's possible. Number two, we are doing it. By the way, in 2023, we are already at minus 12% against 2021, all scopes included. And we are on our way to be carbon neutral by 2038, which is my commitment to my grandchildren. That's point number one. Point number two is that indeed we are promoting mobility devices like the Citroën Ami or the Fiat Topolino, which are affordable, zero emission, and they have 1/3 of the usual footprint of a car. So we are bringing silence, we are bringing no emissions, and we are bringing less usage of the areas, mainly in the urban areas. In addition to that, we also consider that we are now proposing, and it is public, more compact cars which are zero emission. And when we were talking about green colonialism, which I think is a very appropriate theme, we are not addressing the gorilla in the room. And the gorilla in the room is what are the global North countries doing to share their wealth with the global South? And as we know, this is the big hot point, difficult point of all the COP conferences, which are about sharing the wealth, global North towards global South. And this is the gorilla in the room. So we can focus on cars, it's fine, no problem with the cars, we can change them, we can even do something else than cars. If the societies in which we operate are expecting that, we can promote zero-emission vehicles, which we are doing, smaller vehicles, as it was requested. All of this is now on sale. I'm not saying underway, on sale. And I don't know any Western country that will be carbon neutral by 2038. If there is one, please mention it. That is exactly the reality of what we are doing. At the end of the day, I think the big issue is the wealth distribution around the planet between the global North and the global South. And we are talking a lot about Western Europe, etc., but Western Europe should be leading the way in changing the lifestyle, which actually it's not. And it's not the car makers who are deciding that, it's the population, the citizens who decide that through the elections in the democratic world. And this is the change of direction that needs to come out of the polls, out of the elections, if need be. That's my comment, Cecilia. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So, Carlos, I think you said we shouldn't expect to see gigantic electric SUVs, or that shouldn't be our aspiration in the future, I take it. So, Matthias, I'm going to ask you our last question. We've talked around this topic a lot, and we did get a question from our audience that was specifically directed to you. We need to do better with fewer resources and move towards forms of collective mobility. That's a quote that you shared with us publicly on our website. So how can we find a mobility system that can satisfy the people's needs in the different conditions in the world, matching with the world emission reduction?
I mean, the question is too big for me to answer in less than 1 minute remaining. But I think one key is that, and this also links a bit to the last question, I think we need to distinguish between the real needs people have, the need to getting from A to B, and certain types of need satisfiers. So means of satisfying these needs, for example, a car, but this could also be other forms of mobility. And this distinction opens a way to look beyond mere technological solutions to what I consider the much more transformative and more effective solutions, in particular, given the magnitude of the climate emergency we are in and the short time frame we have for solutions. So this means radically shifting towards public transportation, making public transportation affordable. I don't see the mobility devices Carlos presented as the solution, but rather as another means of finding niche markets. I understand that companies need to do this, but I think from a societal perspective, we have to be quite clear that affordable transportation, public transportation, is the much more effective solution. Just very shortly commenting on the German experiment that was launched after the COVID crisis of having a €9 ticket, giving everyone access to all the public transportation around the entire country and also all the regional trains. I think these are the forms of making it accessible for everyone and really creating the more transformative changes that are necessary at this moment. And this also means getting rid of all the high profit business cases, such as electronic SUVs, for example. I think in the situations, companies just should not sell these anymore, even though they are very profitable.
So thank you for that, Matthias. And now as we wrap up this last piece, there are a few observations. One, we need to broaden our thinking about mobility, not just physical mobility, but the social mobility that physical mobility enables. There's been lots that has happened to create the social inequities that we see across the globe as a result of our mobility solutions that we have in place today. And as we think about solutions and move to greener solutions and more sustainable solutions, we need to do that with not only the environment in mind, but we need to think about the social impact of it as well. Also, one thing that strikes me is we need to remember that there is no one solution. We've heard folks say we want EVs, but that's not the solution. We want public transportation, but that's not the solution. Perhaps we need to think about a portfolio of solutions so that you have the best solution applied to the specific population need so that everyone has their needs met. So now let's move on to wrap the debate. For the past 2 hours, we've explored a range of perspectives on one question: how will our planet accommodate the mobility needs of 8 billion people? I believe there are 3 key themes to take away from the conversation that we just heard. First, innovation is a key component of our global efforts to meet the mobility needs of 8 billion people. Technological innovation enables us to address the issue of resource scarcity and is essential to developing sustainable means of transport. Innovative business models are required to shift to more sustainable mobility systems. And finally, we need to innovate from a societal standpoint, rethinking our mobility habits and lifestyles. Second, equity needs to be considered in each step of our transition from our current operating models to our future ones. Inclusivity should be a key criterion for this shift if we genuinely want to enhance the accessibility to mobility and opportunities for everyone. And lastly, we can safely say that the planet cannot accommodate the way we operate today. With that in mind, there is a pressure to rethink what mobility means to each and all of us, leading us to question and challenge our perceptions and mindsets around mobility. So, how will our planet accommodate the mobility needs of 8 billion people? We must collectively prioritize efficiency, sustainability, and equity. This involves a leveling of the mobility playing field for everyone while adapting our lifestyles and mobility habits to consume fewer resources. Now, I'd like to give the floor back to our 3 students. You all came up with important questions and very interesting insights in your speeches. So could you please restate your calls to action to not only our panelists, but to our broader audience? Abir. Abir, can you go?
We cannot continue to consume our planet's resources as though they are infinite. I call on us to prioritize innovation-driven solutions for resource-efficient mobility, even if it means disrupting traditional industries and livelihoods.
Thank you. And Sasha.
Thank you, Cecilia. We cannot solve our global mobility challenges in silos, nor with our existing business models. I call on companies, public leaders, and civil society to collaborate to rethink the value equation and design the right mobility ecosystem that's tailored to local constraints and opportunities.
Thank you. And Amanda?
Thank you, Cecilia. The mobility decisions to date have not taken into account the needs of geographically and economically diverse populations. I call on each and every one of you to think about what we need to do today to equitably advance social mobility for both current and future generations.
Thank you, Abir, Sasha, and Amanda. And finally, a broader round of thank yous to the 3 universities, ENSA, HEC, and the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis, to all the students raising your voices of the youth, and to your supervisors. Thank you to Alexandre Devenot and the team at YouGov, who brought us insights from their exclusive survey, the teams who worked to prepare this debate, the members of our advisory board and panel of experts for their contributions throughout the year. Thank you to our panelists for sharing your perspectives and expertise. And finally, a thanks to you, our audience, for your participation and your questions. In the coming days on our website, freedomofmobility.org, you will be able to access a more detailed summary of the key takeaways, a replay of today's events, and transcripts of the debate in several languages. Already on the site are the complete YouGov study and the research reports from our students. In 2 hours, we were only able to graze the surface of this year's question. The discussion will continue on our website, within your communities, and on social media. During the year, the forum team will curate papers and conduct interviews that will be placed on our website monthly to keep this discussion going. I hope you join us there, and we hope to see you next year. Until then, I encourage you to think about how your choices impact our planet and the freedom of mobility for all its citizens.